the FBI was started in 1908. By 1911, there was already an anti-radical law on the books. By 1910, 1911, there were some others. 1910 was the Mann Act. So the superstructure was already there for the abuses to take hold. It needed somebody powerful to see that, and J. Edgar Hoover was the one that saw that.
And his first employment is not as a lawyer, but is in the alien registration section of the Department of Justice. So he begins right away in, you might say, in law enforcement. And interestingly enough, in terms of his long-term career, his responsibility is to monitor radicals.
The Socialist Party was, when you think about it, it's kind of mind-blowing. They had 5,000 locals throughout the country. They had about 120,000 members at their high point, but they had a press that, one weekly, for example, the Appeal to Reason, had 760,000 subscribers. So you had this tremendous upsurge of popular support for the Socialist Party in 1917. And then, because we were in the war, you had tremendous concern on the part of the federal government. So you had a lot of activity designed to repress the anti-war movement and in general, and the Socialist Party and the IWW in particular. The federal government removed all socialist publications and all anti-war publications, not all of whom were socialist, from the mails in 1917, 1918. So the Appeal to Reason, which had 600,000–700,000 subscribers and depended entirely on the mails for them to be delivered, was essentially wiped out.
Well, I think there were these parallel themes in American history. And you had the Jeffersonian theme and Madisonian theme of freedom and the rights that found their way into our Bill of Rights. And then you had the Alien and Sedition Acts. But these two themes have coexisted in America, and different ones assert themselves at different times. And after major wars, the repressive theme has generally come to the fore, so that after World War I, you saw the Palmer raids and the persecution of anarchists and radicals and wobblies.
There might not have been a first Red Scare had not the Attorney General of the United States, A. Mitchell Palmer, not wanted to get the presidential nomination from an ailing Woodrow Wilson. And he is whipping up with the typical kind of Hearst press, whipping up sensationalism in the country at a time of when the war is over and prosperity seems to be within one's reach, and isolationism is becoming a national passion. To blame whatever tensions and problems you've got on the country on these immigrants that can easily be deported. There are bombs going off. 1919 is a violent year. So there's craziness, but there's also A. Mitchell Palmer.
In the early morning hours of June the 2nd, 1919, opportunity presented itself when a bomb exploded on the front porch of Palmer's house. Palmer's reaction was swift. Sensing an opportunity to secure the Democratic nomination, in 1920 he appointed a young John Edgar Hoover as his special assistant, thus beginning the infamous Palmer raids.
He's not tainted by the Palmer raids for the very reason that they're known as the Palmer raids. Even though Hoover played a central role in the planning and execution of those raids in January of 1920, A. Mitchell Palmer, who was the Attorney General, who had aspirations for the Democratic presidential nomination, takes credit for them. The real planning for the raids are done by Hoover and the head of the Immigration Bureau, Anthony Caminetti. I mean, they're the ones who really pull off the Palmer raids of January 1920.
The Palmer raids had to do more with the Russian Revolution and the fear of communist aliens, which was tremendously unrealistic and exaggerated, but was used as an excuse to disrupt and destroy both the political movement, which was a socialist movement, and also the IWW, which was a really more of an anarchist than a socialist labor movement.
Somewhere in the vicinity of 15,000 people were caught up in this by the police agencies that were operating to conduct the raids. They were operating under the central control authority of the GID. Local police agencies were used, local police personnel were used for the most part under the supervision of government agents, federal agents, what would later be known as FBI agents.
Hoover begins to maintain and to accumulate massive amounts of information about radical organizations and individuals, but also non-radicals, because you have, for example, like Senator Robert La Follette being a subject, the Settlement House reformer Jane Addams being a subject.
It was mass action, a nationwide action, undertaken by what could be viewed quite rightly as the predication of a national political police force in the United States. What was at issue were not acts on the part of those targeted, but the political outlook, the political ideology, which was expressed by those who were targeted. And they were penalized, quite directly penalized, for expressing a political viewpoint which was not acceptable to the North American status quo. No more, no less.
In 1919, there was a young agent of what was then called the Bureau of Justice, which later became the Justice Department, and later the FBI emerged out of that. An agent who was in charge of what we would call the Black Squad in 1919 targeted Marcus Garvey, and that agent's name was J. Edgar Hoover. In 1919, J. Edgar Hoover was the case agent of the Bureau of Justice in charge of disrupting the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
Memo, Department of Justice, October 11th, 1919, memorandum from Mr. Ridgely. I am transmitting herewith a communication which has come to my attention from the Panama Canal, Washington office, relative to the activities of Marcus Garvey. Garvey is a West Indian Negro, and in addition to his activities in endeavoring to establish the Black Star Line Steamship Corporation, he has also been particularly active among the radical elements in New York City in agitating the Negro movement. Unfortunately, however, he has not as yet violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien from the point of view of deportation. It occurs to me, however, from the attached clipping that there might be some proceeding against him for fraud in connection with his Black Star Line propaganda, and for this reason I am transmitting the communication to you for your appropriate attention.
We know that, for instance, there are files that were kept on people during the 1919 riot in Chicago, Army intelligence. And as you said, there were allies that were solicited by these agencies. The NAACP, for instance, is notorious. Joel Spingarn, who was one of the, the famous Spingarn Medal is named for, was, and one of the men who founded the NAACP was an agent of the FBI who regularly informed on African American leadership and participants in the NAACP.
Following World War I and amid cries for a return to normalcy, the Republican Party nominated Warren G. Harding. It was said Harding's only apparent qualifications for the job was that he looked presidential. Harding now became president. William Burns, owner of an anti-union private investigation agency, became the new head of the Bureau of Investigation. The Bureau was soon a dumping ground for political hacks and was used as a police force against Harding administration opponents, including the mainstream Democratic Party. Corruption in the Harding administration began to attract public attention as a result of House hearings on oil leasing contracts at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. A young Hoover now appeared side by side with Attorney General Doherty at congressional hearings. Doherty would attack those critical of the Harding administration as radicals. Hoover would leave the hearings untainted by Doherty's politically motivated campaign.
The time is 1924. A young Washington lawyer in the Department of Justice is named director of the scandal-ridden Bureau of Investigation. His name, John Edgar Hoover. That is when the scandal stopped. The new director met the first of many challenges, and won. A few years later, when the name of the organization was changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, its reputation, like its seal, stood for fidelity, bravery, and most of all, integrity. It still does.
The director position is not a major sinecure. It might be in '72 when Hoover dies. The Bureau at this time is not a very powerful agency. It is inconceivable, if we go back to 1924, that you appoint as director of the Bureau someone who's only 29 years old, and that's all Hoover is in 1924. And that speaks to the fact that it's not considered a major appointment.
In 1928, J. Edgar Hoover hires a former aide to Secretary of War Newton Baker for the FBI. His name was Clyde Tolson. Tolson, not yet 28, is clean-cut, athletic, and had studied law at Hoover's alma mater, George Washington University, and within 2 years is promoted to assistant director of the FBI.
Tolson becomes the #2 man in the Bureau. One, because he's very loyal to the director, and he shares Hoover's commitment and interests in the Bureau. But he's also a hands-on administrator. Individuals report through Tolson. It allows Hoover to delegate responsibility, at the same time knowing that his priorities and that his policies are going to be honored. And in that sense, while they have a social relationship, they go out to lunch, they're always seen together, and there's a basis for the rumor that they're homosexual, that, I think, misses the fact that the relationship is a professional relationship.
Hoover was the head of our national secret police, even though we always denied that we had one. Hoover was obsessed with the so-called communist menace. Hoover was a master manipulator and a master bureaucrat, and because he had access to the files, the dossiers, the background material on his bosses, he was, in effect, his own boss. There were no restraints on him other than his own sensitive bureaucratic antenna.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States. Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
He was the one who basically coordinated, to the extent that there was any coordination. It wasn't rational coordination, but he was the closest thing to being, and through his organization, in touch with all of the various facets of the so-called Red Hunt, and so he was the major contributor to what David Coate has called the Great Fear.
In framing my answer to that question, I must emphasize the points that I have raised before. The question of communism is in no way related to this inquiry, which is an attempt to get control of the screen and to invade the basic rights of American citizens in all fields.
You'll have to stop, or you will leave the witness stand. And you'll leave the witness stand because you're in contempt. That's why you'll leave the witness stand. And if you're just trying to force me to put you in contempt, you won't have to try much harder. And you know what's happened to a lot of people that have been in contempt of this committee this year, don't you?
The question here relates not only to the question of my membership in any political organization, but this committee is attempting to establish the right, which is historically denied to any committee of this sort, to invade the rights and privileges and immunities of American citizens, whether they be Protestant or Methodist or Jewish or Catholic, whether they for the Bill of Rights, which you are trying to destroy.
Take this man away from the stand. John Howard Lawson refused to answer the question, are you a member of the Communist Party? he is attempting to thwart the hearings and investigations of this committee. Therefore, it is the unanimous opinion of this subcommittee that John Howard Lawson is in contempt of Congress.
Initially, there is a willingness on the part of the FBI to provide assistance to HUAC when it becomes a permanent committee after 1945, most notably during the Hollywood hearings in 1947. The committee was sort of floundering. They gave the word out that they were in this above their head. They needed help, and they approached the head of the FBI's Los Angeles office when they were out there trying to conduct interviews and to make the judgment whether they should hold planned hearings that year. Hoover's response to this request for assistance is expedite.
Investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry must not be considered or interpreted as an attack on the industry itself.
The first of the screen stars to testify before the Committee on Un-American Activities is veteran actor Adolphe Menchou. Once known as the screen's best-dressed man, he states,
"The Communist Party in the United States should be outlawed by the Congress of the United States. It is not a political party. It's a conspiracy to take over our government by force, which would enslave the American people as the Soviet government, 14 members of the Politburo, hold the Russian people in abject slavery."
The court is packed with fashionably dressed women as witness Robert Taylor takes the stand. In answer to a committee question on whether the Communist Party should be outlawed in America, Mr. Taylor replies,
"I personally certainly do believe that the Communist Party should be outlawed. However, I'm not an expert on politics or of what the reaction would be. If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place."
The congressional investigation is not a judicial hearing, but refusal to testify results in a contempt of Congress charge. Next on the list of witnesses is Ronald Reagan, who says,
"I will be frank with you that as a citizen, I would hesitate, or I would not like to see any political party outlawed on the basis of its political ideology, because we've spent 170 years in this country on the basis that democracy is strong enough to stand up and fight for itself against the inroads of any ideology, no matter how much we may disagree with it."
Well, I guess if one looks at them, we deal with Hoover's set of priorities. There was an interest in developing source of information. And Ronald Reagan, very early on, is turned into an informant for the Bureau, and he's given a specific code number. The reason being is that he can provide information about communist influence in Hollywood. You can say, what interest does the Bureau have during the World War II period when we're allying with the Soviet Union? Beyond that, what interest does it have when this simply involves the private sector? There is this fascination, indeed obsession, with the subversive threat posed by communism to American society that explains the interest in recruiting Ronald Reagan. Walt Disney is another can of worms. Walt Disney has a run-in with the Screen Actors Guild and their attempt to unionize the film industry in the 1930s. And he appears before the committee in 1947 and talks about communist attempts to infiltrate Hollywood, and derives from his very strong anti-union and conservative bent.
Again, it was a circuit of connections, the victims of which were people who had engaged in political activity, usually earlier in their lives.
Well, during the early 1930s and even after sort of 1935, a lot of American writers were profoundly unhappy with the social conditions in the United States and, of course, wrote about them extensively. So a number of writers joined groups, for instance, like the League of American Writers, which, they would hold congresses in New York, lobby for better social conditions, basically.
Why did the FBI keep track of American writers? It's a very simple answer: to control opinion in America. J. Edgar Hoover understood very well the power of words and what they could do. In fact, a theory I have is that he often imitated what he feared. And he feared words so much that for the most of his life, he imitated the journalists he feared by taking over their columns when they were on vacation. The friendly journalists would ask him to do that. And he would have the Bureau write books for him. And in fact, his most famous book, Masters of Deceit, became a bestseller because the Bureau helped make it a bestseller. Whatever communist threat this country might have had in the 30s and 40s, it certainly didn't need an even greater threat, which was a threat to our Constitution in overtaking it.
The primitives took over, the Neanderthals took over. It's simple as that. By the way, we say right one or beat left. That doesn't mean, I think the idea of Neanderthalism took over. Not just anti-intellectual, it's contempt for working people, too.
Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police. That's what some people would like to do. We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. We're not going to turn the United States into a right-wing totalitarian country in order to deal with a left-wing totalitarian threat. In short, we're not going to end democracy. We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books.
As post-war relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, Hoover and his congressional allies with the business community and the press mobilized public opinion. The Truman administration, under attack from conservatives, sought to avert criticism by instituting loyalty oaths for federal employees.
The standards that are adopted for the loyalty program are not rigid standards. I mean, they involve reasonable grounds for belief that an individual is disloyal and becomes reasonable doubt as to loyalty. So in a sense, authorizes broad-based organizations, not only on applicants for federal employment, but potential applicants for federal employment. So it really becomes, you might say, the Magna Carta for the Bureau's permanent role in investigating subversive activities.
And I'm not the first one to say it, but we had a police state and it was a secret one.
Another technique that the FBI was doing as well, that was break-ins, not to install bugs, but to obtain information. They would break into an organization to retrieve membership lists, subscription lists, correspondence, because this was valuable information that could not be otherwise obtained. FBI officials described this procedure as clearly illegal.
Well, we called it black bag jobs originally. That came from the fact that agents back during wartime carried the camera and lock-picking tools and equipment to steam open envelopes in a black bag. It was a time of hysteria. We thought we were going to be in World War III almost any day. And I thought, well, okay, so we're in World War III, that's not why I joined. I wanted to put bank robbers in jail and put gangsters in jail.
In 1939, 2 days after the Nazi invasion of Poland, Whittaker Chambers sought a meeting with Assistant Secretary of State Adolf Berle. At that meeting, Chambers, a former member of the Communist Party who claimed to have left the party in 1935, named Alger Hiss, then working in the State Department, as a communist. Berle saw Chambers' allegations as absurd, stating, "I thought I was dealing with a man who thought that he was telling the truth, but was probably afflicted with neurosis." Chambers later went to the FBI with the same story, claiming to have no documentation of Hiss's alleged treason, and the matter was dropped until an opportunistic young congressman from California named Richard Nixon appeared.
In the case of the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings in the Alger Hiss-Whittaker Chambers case in 1948, what the Bureau does is provide information to Nixon during the onset of those hearings in August of '48, and it does so indirectly. An FBI agent who had been the source of a report written by Father John Cronin for the Catholic bishops acts as an intermediary and provides information to Father Cronin, who relays it on to Nixon. So what you have here is a system by which Nixon acquires information indirectly, but also non-traceable to the Bureau.
3 weeks of spy charges and countercharges reached their climax. Whittaker Chambers, confessed ex-communist, has sworn under oath that Alger Hiss, former high State Department officer, was a Red. Hiss, here entering, has denied it under oath. Now they face each other in public for the first time. The committee asks Hiss,
Mr. Hiss,
Would you kindly stand up, please? Mr. Chambers, would you stand up? Have you ever seen this individual who is standing?
I have.
Do you know him?
I identify him, Mr. Stripling.
As who?
As George Crosby.
His sworn testimony directly contradicts Chambers on almost every point, from the disposition of his car and apartment to his party connection. Hiss names 34 prominent Americans with whom he worked, including Senators Vandenberg and Connolly, and former State Secretaries Hull, Stettinius, and Burns.
Ask them if they ever found in me anything except the highest adherence to duty and honor. Then the committee can judge and the public can judge whether to believe a self-discredited accuser whose names and aliases are as numerous and as casual as his accusations. The other side of this question is the reliability of the allegations before this committee, the undocumented statements of the man who now calls himself Whittaker Chambers. Is he a man of consistent reliability, truthfulness, and honor? Clearly not. He admits it and the committee knows it.
Chambers, who has already sworn that he pleaded with Hiss to join him in leaving the party, is recalled in the middle of the dramatic 9-hour session. Asked why he singled out Hiss, he replies,
"The story is spread in testifying against Mr. Hiss. I'm working out some old grudge for motives of revenge or hatred. I don't hate Mr. Hiss. We were close friends, but we are caught in the tragedy of history. Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting. I've testified against him with remorse and pity.
Why is Hoover's FBI helping Nixon at this time? And clearly it's not doing the Truman administration a favor. And it's involved in part of its attempts to suggest that there's a very serious internal security threat. And that's the politics that the Bureau is involved in across the board in the post-war period.
These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union.
Hiss was convicted following the well-dramatized uncovering of 5 rolls of microfilm that Chambers claimed he had hidden in a pumpkin. 3 of the 5 rolls contained no information at all but were U.S. government patents. The other 2 rolls would be used to convict Hiss of perjury.
Well, remember that Senator McCarthy came upon the scene quite late. He should have known about the communist issue in American politics and shows some evidence of it before 1950. He called a newspaper in Madison pro-communist. In fact, its editor was a member of the Communist Party. But he doesn't really get into it until he stumbles on it very late, just a few days after Alger Hiss is convicted of perjury. And this is early 1950, it's February. And he goes to Wheeling, West Virginia on a barnstorming tour no one else wanted to go on. It was a Lincoln Day speech that he gave, and stumbled onto the issue of communism. He had been trying since entering the Senate to make a name for himself, to become somebody, and he'd been unsuccessful. And suddenly he was on the front pages and President Truman was condemning him.
Communist in the faculty of one university is one communist too many. One communist among the American advisors at Yalta was one communist too many. And even if there were only one communist in the State Department, Department. Even if there are only one communist in the State Department, that would still be one communist too many.
McCarthy appears and says, I have the names of 205 known communists. And while the numbers change, it implies that not only are there communists in the State Department, but they are known to the administration. The administration did nothing about them. And what it does, it allows Hoover to play both ends of the street. This information cannot be released. One of the rationale that Truman offers is that it would compromise the Bureau's investigative procedures because it would disclose information that would be only helpful to foreign spies. And because it cannot be released, you have McCarthy saying that the purpose of non-release is a cover-up.
He gets the name McCarthyism because he is the most outspoken, the most colorful, the most outrageous, calling George Marshall the #1 spy in the country, the most careless of them all. And he became a good target for the opponents of the Second Red Scare because he was vulnerable. He was almost always lying and bluffing. So the name stuck. It was a name invented by the cartoonist Herbert Bloch, who's still around, Herblock, in the Washington Post.
You are, of course, one of the most controversial figures we've had in the Senate in a long time. And you have the distinction of having coined a new word for the dictionary, namely McCarthyism. Now, how do you define McCarthyism, sir?
Mr. Huey, I didn't coin the phrase. The Daily Worker originated the phrase. Out of the first paper that used it, it's their phrase. We let them define it.
Now,
to them it means, of course, fighting communism. Or putting it the way one columnist did the other day, he said, apparently McCarthyism means calling a man a communist who is later proven to be one.
It could just as well be called Hooverism because without the FBI and without J. Edgar Hoover, there would have been no Second Red Scare. How the FBI was leaking information to Nixon and to McCarthy. At one point, Ed Neller was a speechwriter for McCarthy, and Fulton Lewis Jr., the most important ultra-conservative broadcaster in America at the time, listened to by millions nightly, and was a former FBI agent who was smuggling documents into both of them. And I had a long talk with him several times, conversations, and he described all of this to me. There's a lot of evidence that Hoover was behind the Second Red Scare.
With the outbreak of war in Korea and the firing of General MacArthur, the Red Scare and Hoover's power attained new heights. The Eisenhower administration used the communist issue and the war to its advantage during the campaign of 1952 against Adlai Stevenson. Following the election, the Republicans and the Bureau continued to use anti-communist hysteria to attack Truman's prior administration.
Hoover surely was not just a cynical type. There has to be within him, in my judgment, a strong element of the true believer. He and McCarthy hit it off early, and we don't know the exact origins of it, but we do know that they were good friends, and they shared their anti-communism. Remember that both men would be less dangerous if they were totally cynical, because the really dangerous people in life are not the hucksters who are shaking you down. They are the people whose price you cannot pay. They're the true believers.
Memo, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to FBI Associate Director Clyde Tolson, December 1st, 1952. On November 28, 1952, Senator Joseph McCarthy called and stated he would become chairman of the Senate Committee investigating government operations and expenditures. He stated he would be in need of a good staff and asked that I give some thought to recommending to him a number of competent investigators that he might consider for appointment to the staff. I would like to have this given prompt attention.
During the Eisenhower campaign, I spoke from coast to coast, promising the American people that if they would elect the Eisenhower administration, that they would be assured of a vigorous, forceful fight against communists in government. Unfortunately, in this I was mistaken.
Now, the whole point of the Second Red Scare is to win in 1952. Nixon was put on the ticket because he was a McCarthyite and was the ambassador to the extreme right. It worked. they won. Now, the second Red Scare was supposed to go away. The problem was that McCarthy didn't get the message, no matter how much they tried to tell him. And he continued his investigations. By now, he's drinking quite hard. He's got Roy Cohn at his side, and that's a whole story in itself. Roy Cohn is pushing him and getting him into trouble, and he's out of control.
Hoover, after 1954, distanced himself radically, in some ways, from McCarthy, going so far as to say that he had always felt that the individual was an unsavory character, that he personally detested him, and that he had done his best to thwart the activities of the committee through non-performance. When they asked him to engage in investigative activities that he felt was improper, he sandbagged that. That was his story. And from his point of view, what McCarthyism had to accomplish had been significantly accomplished by 1954. And once Joe McCarthy began to make his strange utterances about pink tendencies in the General Officers Corps of the United States Army, this under an administration in which the chief executive is a former chief general officer of the United States Army, he knew that the point had been reached which damage of a serious nature was going to result, and he separated himself from McCarthy at that time. And through the propaganda venue managed to make it appear as if he had always been separate, and in fact resistant to McCarthyism. And it was a brilliant ploy.
Here was a person who understood power and understood the limits of power. I mean, to understand these separate filing procedures that Hoover devised is to realize that if you're going to head an agency and you're going to authorize illegal activities, if you're going to disseminate information, you have to do so in a way that you can't be caught. And so you have what is an atmosphere of lawlessness created in Hoover's FBI. The ends justify the means. The desired information can be only so obtained, and so we should obtain it without concern about how we obtain it. And when they reach the decision to move away from internal security by 1958 to criminal investigations, they are essentially immunizing individuals in organized crime from prosecution.
June memo, FBI Assistant Director James Gale to FBI Assistant Director Cartha Deloche, May 27, 1966. Synopsis. The purpose of this memorandum is what, if any, notice should be given to the Department concerning the extent of our microphone coverage. A review of our microphone coverage from 1960 to the present revealed that the 3 investigative divisions operated a total of 738 such units during this period. The Justice Department and/or U.S. Attorney were notified of 158 of these sources. In numerous of our top hoodlum cases, the Department has frequently found legal reasons or constitutional reasons in justification for their failure to initiate prosecution.
The problem is that if you're going to move against organized crime, you can't move against it in the same ways against the Communist Party. Leak information to HUAC or to friendly reporters like Walter Trohan. You have to prosecute. But you can't prosecute if the information is illegally obtained, and you have no other way of laundering that information. In other words, if you have an informer in there, that informer can surface in trial and testify about what he's learned through his infiltration of an organization. But if your only source is a bug, there's no way you can present that information to a grand jury or present that information in trial. And so it becomes very difficult to prosecute. But it also becomes a problem because you can't tell the Attorney General why you can't develop information. Because to do so would be disclosed that you've obtained this both illegally and without his prior knowledge and authorization. It really puts the FBI in a bind. Hoover was not an eminent criminologist. He was a preeminent bureaucrat and who knew how to make a relatively weak office into a very powerful office. And by the end of his life, he was a person who might not be the co-equal of the president, but was in many respects independent of the president.
Hoover collected information not just on active political subversives or criminals, but upon virtually everyone in a position of power who might affect the destiny of him, the director, or the bureau he directed. Every human being, it was his premise, has fallibilities, have skeletons in their closets. It was his business to find out what they were and to make sure that they knew that he knew what they were, so that if they began to intervene in any way that materially affected his operation, he could rattle the bones of those skeletons, drawing their attention to the fact that he could, at his discretion, make information which would be uncomfortable and perhaps damaging to them public, and thereby deter them from taking any serious stance in opposition to any aspect of FBI policy.
They were keeping files on congressmen, and under the Privacy Act, a number of us got our files. We never did know what Hoover had under his desk in a drawer. He was always suspected of having files that had never gone into the FBI databank. Those of us who got our files did not find regular files on us where we would be mentioned in our file. Now, when I asked for my Freedom of Information file, privacy file, it took 2 agents to carry it in because I had been very active, and but it wasn't a business-like investigation, an ongoing investigation of me. It was sort of random, but it had some nasty things in it. For example, in 1970, when I had decided not to run again for re-election for personal reasons, a memo was sent around the FBI to Deloach and the rest of them. They checked it with a little AP story. Down at the bottom, Hoover had "good riddance." Well, I got that in my privacy file, and so I framed it. It's in my apartment.
Hoover so terrorized his own agents that, you know, if he sneezed, they all took out their handkerchiefs. And so once, for example, he wrote on a memorandum that someone sent him, "Watch the borders," by which he meant that the margins were too narrow. And a bunch of agents were sent down to the Mexican-American border.
When I became an agent, 1966, J. Edgar Hoover was very much in command. I paraded through the line. It's kind of caricatured often. Paraded through this line of agents, shook his hand, everybody scared to death, not so much the agents, who I think were too new in the FBI and naive to realize the significance of this little show or charade or whatever you want to call it. But the counselors and the other people around us were terrified that somebody will make some slip up because he allegedly had this sixth sense that could see through the normal person and pick out the flaw, and I guess to reinforce this, every once in a while he would just say, "I didn't like that one that looked like a truck driver," and of course they'd have to line everybody up and figure out which one looked like a truck driver and let 1, 2, 3, or 4 go.
Well, COINTELPRO is a concept more than a program, and we know, at least in terms of as long as there's been an FBI and before it a Department of Justice with under Hoover, that there was a COINTELPRO concept. So you start right out in 1919 with the Palmer raids and Hoover's involvement in that, and then you deal with how they were dealing with people like Paul Robeson and Marcus Garvey before that, and the government was, with all those kinds of leaders, attempting to destroy them, to discredit them, and to make sure that they weren't effective in the movements that they worked in. As we get into the 40s and 50s, we start to see them focusing much more on the Socialist Workers' Party, the Communist Party, and in America, and they're starting to actually have it as a program under the name COINTELPRO. They're refining it to some degree. They're disrupting those activities. They're trying to get people fired. They're using newspapers to discredit people. They have their own reporters that are almost on staff at the FBI, where they can feed all sorts of defamatory information when they want to discredit a leader.
They used the term neutralize, but no one ever defined what neutralize meant. And so with, say, 8,000 FBI agents across the country, you're going to get maybe 8,000 different views of what neutralize means.
The FBI itself, its structure, was one which was never, of course, happy with the struggle. The fact that Martin Luther King was, phones were tapped, and the problems that J. Edgar Hoover gave him was clear. We only put King out. We expected it from us and SNCC, but certainly King was not a flaming revolutionary calling for the destruction of America. He was a reformist, trying to, in fact, improve America, and was good for the image of America.
If you can imagine living under the eyes of the FBI for all those years of his life, not one place he went, or phone call that he made, or hotel that he stayed in was not bugged, wiretapped, or the room was bugged, and then sent his wife tapes and all kind of, mad stuff.
King, in view of your low grade, I will not dignify your name with either a Mr. or a Reverend or a Doctor, and your last name calls to mind only the type of king such as King Henry VIII. King, look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud and a great liability to all of us Negroes. White people in this country have enough frauds of their own, but I am sure they don't have one at this time that is anywhere near your equal. You are no clergyman, and you know it. I repeat, you are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that. You could not believe in God. Clearly you don't believe in any personal moral principles. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. You could have been our greatest leader. You, even at an early age, have turned out to be not a leader, but a dissolute, abnormal, moral imbecile. We will now have to depend on our older leaders like Wilkins, a man of character, and thank God we have others like him. But you are done. Your honorary degrees, your Nobel Prize, what a grim farce, and other awards will not save you. King, I repeat, you are done. No person can overcome facts, not even a fraud like yourself. I repeat, no person can argue successfully against facts. You are finished, and some of them to pretend to be ministers of the gospel. Satan could not do more. What incredible evilness, King, you are done. The American public, the church organizations that have been helping Protestant, Catholic, and Jews will know you for what you are, an evil, abnormal beast. So will others who have backed you. You are done. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation.
What you had was a situation where people were working for the Bureau as undercover agents in organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and put in effect an impossible position in a democracy. You'd have an agent riding in a car with Klansmen who are in the process of shooting and killing, as it happened, a civil rights worker, Viola Liuzzo. And sitting in the car is an FBI agent as undercover person. So that's one of the conundrums of a secret police agency in a democratic society. I think personally that you can't have undercover agents who take part in unconstitutional activities for no less murder as part of their undercover things. If they're ever going to blow their cover, that's the time to do it.
Growing civil unrest brought on by the war in Vietnam and rebellions in the black community had easily convinced Hoover that all this was a communist plot. Hoover, however, was not alone in his observations. President Johnson and the mainstream press found similar beliefs a convenient tool.
Our problem has been, as black people, we've always been concerned about white America, never about us. And what we've always thought is that white America equal the same interest as us. That is not true. We must now be concerned with us. Let me give you some examples. We always want to prove what good Americans we are. The very first man to die for the War of Independence in this country was a black man named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks. He was a fool. Because here he was dying for white folk freedom, and millions of his brothers were enslaved in the very country. Oh, but we wanted to prove what great Americans we were. We begged the white folk to let us fight in the War of Independence, and they said no. So we organized ourselves in bands of armies, training ourselves with our bare foot to prove to the white folk what great Americans we were. Please let us fight, white folk. And finally they came and inspected our troops and said, good niggers, you can fight. And they had us fighting the Indians. Like fools, we should have teamed up with the Indians and take care of you know who.
If John Edgar Hoover had walked into Lyndon Johnson's office and said, we wish to prepare a document that is a forgery of a goldenrod copy of an informant report to the CIA. We want to make this forgery appear to be from Stokely Carmichael to the CIA. Okay, and we want to wad this sucker up, and we want to stuff it down in the crack of the seat of one of Stokely's friend's cars so it looked like it came out of his pocket, but do it in such a way as this little piece of the yellow rod is sticking out visibly from the crack of the seat so the friend is sure to find it and then share it with his friends in order to discredit Carmichael, to neutralize his political effectiveness, and hopefully to induce such paranoia among his friends that they'll kill him. Lyndon Johnson would have said no, because had it been found out, had something gone wrong, and provably the operation was disclosed in a court of law, so it could be supported by evidence that this was what was done and this was the intent, it would have been conspiracy to commit murder, and Lyndon Johnson could have gone to prison for it. That's how he would have assessed it. But what Hoover would do instead would go in and say, we wish to engage in an operation, sir, to divide Carmichael, who is a highly effective organizer and agitator, from the organization in which he functions in order to destroy his effectiveness as an organizer and to prevent him from recruiting more people to his point of view. And say no more than that. Johnson would say, go ahead.
In the civil rights movement, one thing that happened concurrently is that the war in Vietnam escalated. And when the President of the United States would get on television and say that we were had to increase our military presence in Vietnam or send a number of soldiers in Vietnam in order to defend democracy, the first thing our experience was the hypocrisy of it. We felt that there wasn't a democracy right here in this country.
Richard Nixon was narrowly elected president during the tumultuous year of 1968. Although stating he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam, Nixon steadfastly refused to explain what it was. Upon his election, he moved quickly against the anti-war opposition in the U.S., and for this he turned to the director he had worked with during the Hiss trial, J. Edgar Hoover. Their targets would include the Black Panther Party, SDS, the New Left, and Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and many other pro-peace groups.
Hoover's attitude was that he never could understand how we could be a native-grown movement. Hoover's thinking was that if anything movement to the left popped up, it had to be the creation of the Communist Party and their masters in Moscow. He just couldn't understand how people, for their own reasons in this country, would develop their own American version of radicalism. He sent agents in to try to disrupt us in different ways and carry on all sorts of havoc in the organization. Of course, as a mainly white youth organization, we didn't have nearly the difficulties that the FBI had unleashed on groups like the Black Panther Party or the African American student organizations, where their people paid for the FBI's shenanigans with their lives.
So what we're saying very simply is that if they learn by observation and participation, that we need to do more acting than we need to do writing. And I think the Black Panther Party is doing that. That we didn't talk about a Breakfast for Children program, we've got one. We're not going to tell you how many kids we intend to feed in Chicago. We're feeding 3,000 to 4,000 every week already, and I don't know how many all around the country. We're not talking about beginning to think about treating people free when they need medical services. We're opening a free health clinic in the city of Chicago in less than 3 weeks. These are the type of examples that people can relate to.
So I have a first-hand knowledge. I mean, I've seen families destroyed. I've seen people killed. There are people who are dead now.
you know, that I know that are dead today because the FBI decided that it would take its COINTELPRO program to the extreme. We're here right today in Chicago, and on December, I believe, 9th, 1969, Fred Hampton was murdered in this city, murdered by the FBI in conjunction with the Chicago Police Department and the State's Attorney's Office.
The immediate, violent, criminal reaction of the occupants in shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party. So does their refusal to cease firing at the police officers when urged to do so several times.
With the Fred Hampton case here in Chicago, we, as lawyers for the families of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, learned a great deal about this COINTELPRO program firsthand. When the raid first happened in December of 1969, it appeared to be a police and state's attorney orchestrated raid. He was shot, Fred Hampton was, and killed in his bed early in the morning. They seemed to know he was going to be there. They seemed to know he was going to be asleep in his bed at the time. It was a very bloody raid, but they seemed to feel also that they were going to be able to get away with it and be able to blame the Panthers and their violence.
The FBI took the plan first to the Chicago Gang Intelligence Unit, and I think the Gang Intelligence Unit smelled a rat and said, well, if you think there are guns there, why don't you do the raid? But apparently the FBI wanted deniability, so they went and got a prosecutor who thought that having attacked the Panthers and either killed or arrested the Panther leader would be a feather in his political cap. They got hand to bite for it. 3 years later, after the murder of Fred in an unrelated case, an FBI informant named William O'Neill surfaced and testified. He testified that he'd been an informant when he was in the Panthers. O'Neill was known to be the head of security, supposedly, in the Panthers, and had access to Panther apartments, the Panther office, and so forth. We then sought to get discovery showing what role had O'Neill had. For years, the government stalled and stonewalled and so forth. And actually, they had one document, which was the floor plan that the FBI obtained. And it was in a file called the Do Not File file, which means no copy of that document was included in any other file so that it could be destroyed.
And one document was dated the day before the actual raid on Fred Hampton's apartment. And in that document, it stated that they were planning this raid, that the FBI was supplying information about the raid, and that it was part of the COINTELPRO program.
The Black Panther Party file, it turned out, rather than being the 2 inches thick, which the government had represented, was actually about 57 feet long. So that was the percentage of materials. Included in those files, which came out in the middle of the trial, was the document which indicated the FBI had given informant William O'Neill a $300 bonus for providing the floor plan which led to the raid.
Hoover readily approved of the bonus, which was the modern-day equivalent of 30 pieces of silver, and was sent back, and we assume O'Neill got his bonus. But this document was the third in the trilogy or the triangle of showing that the FBI was not only involved in, but was integral to the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark here in Chicago. That they were not only behind it, but they rewarded the man who set it all up with his floor plan with a bonus. And he got the bonus about the same time that he was serving as a pallbearer in Fred Hampton's funeral, because of course he was still provocateur at that time.
This was followed within a matter of 72 hours by a comparable raid, actually a larger raid, being conducted on the Panther Party headquarters in Los Angeles, in which the apparent intent was to effect a comparable assassination of the local leader there, Geronimo Pratt. That was a failed attempt. People got wind of what was going on and defended the headquarters until daylight, when the press was assembled, and then surrendered to the police under conditions which would not allow for them to be summarily executed. The charges that were supposedly the predication of the raid ultimately proved vacuous. They were acquitted by an all-white jury, as I recall, about a year later in Los Angeles, of everything that they were accused of doing, which justified the raid in the first place. It was an attempt to effect through paramilitary means, the assassination of a key activist in the Black Panther Party.
We were engaged in clearly a war of survival, a war for self-determination, a war for economic freedom, a war for cultural freedom, to be able to learn things of our culture, to regain our historical identity.
I know in Los Angeles that some of the agents set up their informants in the United Slaves, which is us, to assassinate members of the Black Panthers in Los Angeles. One of the problems that the FBI had in getting members of the United Slaves to shoot members of the Black Panther Party was that Geronimo Pratt, who was then the leader, would not retaliate. He was not that kind of a violent person. The only other way to get Pratt out of the way, I mean, they were thinking of trying to get him with a bank robbery conspiracy, but the bank robbery squad worked bank robberies and they weren't interested in some agents on the security squad working a counterintelligence thing. At the end of 30 days, they closed the bank robbery conspiracy case, and the next thing, Pratt is framed for the tennis court murder in Santa Monica.
At the time the tennis court murder occurred, I remember that Pratt came into the Bay Area, that he and Bobby Seale, David Hilliard came over to the place I was staying in San Francisco. We met one evening. The next day and the next 2 days, there were meetings at David Hilliard's house in Oakland, and he was there all the time.
I don't think there's any doubt that the decision would have been different if we had the amount of information that is available now. It was just too close a call in the first place. But back in this was 1972, and we had no clue as to what the government could do or what they did do. And this was unfathomable. You know, 20 years ago, you forget how much that you start to take for granted now. But back then, even though Vietnam was going on, you couldn't believe that your government was doing that at home to one of its own citizens. Not only one of its own citizens, one of its own veterans.
Vietnam Vets Against the War is a organization of anti-war veterans. It was founded in 1967 and eventually grew to almost 50,000 veterans. Dewey Canyon 3 was in April of 1971, and that was the second national demonstration that VVAW had.
Joe Hirsch from New York City. Maybe this will help to save lives. Sal Graziano, New York. I don't want your fucking war.
Robert Jones, New York. I symbolically return all Vietnam medals and other service medals given me by the power structure that has genocidal policies against non-white peoples of the world.
Right on.
All power to the people.
Well, I think at the beginning when we got together, everybody had a naive faith that the FBI only investigated people that were doing wrong and getting ready to blow people up. But just as we became disillusioned with the war in Vietnam after actually having fought there, I think after we actually started becoming demonstrators and exercising our rights, we discovered that the FBI wasn't there to protect our rights, but to take them away. Well, FBI just on VVAW, and that's not individual paperwork. I have my own file, and but just the VVAW files is over 12,000.
SDS was probably the largest radical student organization in American history. We were really a rebellious generation of young people who were angry at everything we saw around us and wanted to change it. Hoover tried throughout his career to try to pin on us the fact that there would be some sinister connection between us and, say, the KGB or Cuban gold or terrorist training centers in other countries. He could never do it because it just basically wasn't true. Later on, they would send people around the country supposedly as SDS organizers. We had a famous one called Tommy the Traveler, and who were FBI plants. And they would go around and try to organize people into SDS chapters and then try to rope them into various illegal activities, gun running schemes and this sort of thing, and so that they could arrest people, or they could then expose it and use this to destroy the organizing ability of the left in that locality for some time to come. Some of them told us that they were, one reason they did what the FBI wanted to them is because they were strung out on drugs. And the FBI threatened, said, well, if you don't want to go to jail, we want you to do some work for us. And they would take advantage of people's weaknesses in those ways.
Now that idea is part of a mentality which J. Edgar Hoover represented. And our capacity for repression, which antedated Hoover, as you point out, in the Alien and Sedition Acts of back then, what Hoover did was he strengthened that theme in our democracy, and it's an anti-democratic theme, and his legacy was to legitimize it.
We are losing the battle when thousands upon thousands of our youth remain morally unfortified against the temptations of a life of crime. And we are hastening the national disaster when we tolerate weaknesses in the administration of justice, weaknesses which enable repeated undeserved leniencies to be showered upon vicious young thugs, robbers, rapists, and murderers. Teenagers who consistently defy the law must be held legally accountable for their crimes against society. They, like their adult counterparts, must learn that there is no privileged class in America. The America we live in today must awaken to the danger. A tidal wave of lawless tyranny is now surging forth from the criminal and subversive underworld. It breaks with abrasive effect against the foundations of our republic. Our national conscience, our heritage of freedom, the entire cause of decency are being severely tested by these